I watched the shadows move across the ridges and traced their paths in my log. I sent my reports through frayed lines, but my superiors treated them as routine. Every detail I recorded felt heavier with each unanswered message. The patterns were clear to me, yet the system could not see them. I stood alone on the hill, knowing the risk and the cost, and waited in silence. In early October 1943, the northern sector of the Italian front was under the control of German forces, facing Allied pressure along a series of ridges that overlooked the strategic approaches to the Adriatic coast. The terrain was rugged, a combination of rocky outcrops and dense woodland, which constrained movement and created natural observation points. The German command had established a network of observation posts and intended to monitor advancing Allied forces and coordinate artillery and small unit responses. It was under these conditions that Corporal Heinrich Bauer, assigned as a lookout within a remote forward post, carried out his routine duties. Bauer was stationed on a small, unassuming hill that overlooked a winding valley. His post, a simple wooden platform with a modest camouflage net, offered an unobstructed view of the approaches from the southeast. Each morning he would ascend the narrow trail leading to the position, binoculars in hand, and check the alignment of his instruments. The tasks themselves were methodical. Record any movement of personnel, vehicles, or unusual activity, verify that communication lines to the main company headquarters were intact, and ensure that maps and sketches of the surrounding area remained current. These were standard procedures, repeated day after day, but the accuracy and attentiveness of the lookout were critical to the effectiveness of larger operational planning. The operational situation in that sector was increasingly complex. Allied reconnaissance had intensified, and sporadic artillery exchanges had become common. Supply lines were stretched, and the German command was cautious, wary of overextending its forces in difficult terrain. Orders emphasized the importance of vigilance from forward positions, with repeated instructions to report any irregularities promptly. In theory, the system was sound. Observation posts would identify threats, relay information, and allow headquarters to allocate reinforcements or adjust defensive positions. In practice, however, the efficiency of the system relied entirely on the consistent performance of individuals at remote and often isolated posts. Bauer, like many of his counterparts, understood the significance of his role, though his daily work largely involved hours of quiet observation punctuated by routine reporting. On the morning of October the 3rd, Bauer's day began like any other. Low clouds hung over the valley, limiting long-range visibility but providing a muted, diffused light that revealed subtle movements along the ridgeline. Bauer carefully scanned the terrain, noting the positions of small groups of Allied engineers and the shadowy outlines of reconnaissance vehicles. He adjusted his binoculars, recorded the times of observed movement in his log, and transmitted routine messages back to company headquarters. At this stage, though no single observation appeared critical, the movements were small, incremental, and easily dismissed amid the broader pattern of daily reconnaissance reports. Despite the calmness of the early hours, the observation post was not without its operational challenges. Communication lines were prone to disruption, often cut by weather or accidental interference, and Bauer had to rely on backup systems that required manual adjustments. In addition, the terrain itself presented difficulties. Shadows could mask movement, and distant observations could be misinterpreted, especially under varying light conditions. These were routine limitations, recognized by the command structure, but not always accounted for in operational planning. Bauer had learned to compensate as best he could, using triangulation from nearby posts and repeated verification, though it required patience and careful attention. As the morning progressed, small anomalies began to appear. A supply vehicle moved slightly off the expected path, a patrol appeared in an area previously considered low risk, and faint traces of tire tracks suggested repeated passage where none had been expected. Individually, these observations might have seemed trivial. Together, however, they suggested the emergence of an operational pattern that warranted closer attention. Bauer noted the irregularities in his log, making annotations to indicate the potential for coordinated movement, though he did not draw definitive conclusions. His instructions were clear: observe and report, not interpret beyond what could be verified. By midday, a faint but steady movement of Allied infantry was visible along a parallel ridge. Bauer adjusted his position slightly to maintain a clear line of sight. His binoculars revealed the careful spacing of soldiers, a pattern consistent with standard reconnaissance patrols. No engagement had occurred, and no immediate threat was apparent. Yet in his log, Bauer made careful note of the times, intervals, and apparent organization of the troops. These details, mundane though they appeared, would later become relevant when higher command reviewed movement patterns and the effectiveness of forward defences. The early afternoon passed without incident, but subtle indications of strain in the operational framework were becoming evident. Communications from neighbouring posts were delayed or garbled, maps did not fully correspond to observed terrain changes, and logistical reports suggested minor but accumulating inconsistencies in troop deployment. Bauer focused on his observations, who recognised these discrepancies as minor, routine limitations, yet they hinted at the larger challenges inherent in maintaining situational awareness in such complex terrain. His work, repetitive and often unremarkable to outsiders, was an essential layer in a system designed to anticipate threats and coordinate response. By late afternoon, the day's observations were compiled and transmitted. Bauer returned to his post repeatedly to ensure the accuracy of messages, precautionary measure acknowledging both the limitations of technology and the critical nature of timely reporting. The operational problem, gaps between observation and decision-making, was present but subtle, and it had not yet manifested in any overt failure, but the early signs were visible to a trained observer. Bauer's attention to detail, while routine in execution, would later be recognised as providing the first recorded indicators of movements that might otherwise have gone unnoticed for days. As evening approached, the low light created further challenges. Shadows lengthened, visibility decreased, and the potential for misinterpretation increased. Bauer remained at his post, scanning systematically, noting any new activity, and verifying that reports reached headquarters. At this stage, there was no immediate crisis. The operational situation was stable in a tactical sense, yet the combination of minor irregularities, communication delays, and environmental factors suggested that the routine work of a single lookout could carry disproportionate weight in the larger operational context. By nightfall, Bauer descended from the observation post. His routine duties for the day were complete. Logs filed, reports transmitted, instruments secured. To outside observers, the day may have appeared uneventful. To Bauer and the small contingent of soldiers responsible for the observation network, however, the subtle irregularities recorded during those hours represented the first hints of an emerging pattern that, in the coming days, would have consequences beyond what could be anticipated in real time. The post remained a quiet vantage point, unassuming and largely unnoticed, yet it occupied a critical role in the operational fabric of the sector. In the days following October 3rd, in 1943, the operational situation in the northern Italian sector began to reveal the limits of the observation network. Reports continued to arrive from Bauer and neighbouring posts detailing minor troop movements, patrol routes and vehicle activity. Headquarters received these accounts alongside routine logistical and intelligence updates. In theory, the compilation of such information should have provided a coherent picture of enemy intentions. In practice, however, the flow of data was fragmented. Communications delays, occasional misinterpretations of coordinates, and competing priorities at command posts contributed to a growing disconnect between observed realities and operational responses. Bauer continued his systematic monitoring each morning, and he recorded small but increasingly consistent patterns. Engineers moving alongside trails previously believed unused, transport vehicles appearing at irregular intervals, and infantry units taking alternate approaches to terrain previously assumed secure. On October the 5th, he observed a small column of reconnaissance troops crossing a lightly wooded ridge at a pace suggesting a larger formation might follow. He transmitted the information promptly, noting the time, spacing, and apparent organization. While headquarters acknowledged the message, no immediate adjustments were made. The reports were logged and filed, but operational decisions did not yet reflect the subtle shifts Bauer had documented. The following day, Bauer noted additional deviations. Artillery placements were observed in positions not reflected on existing maps. The troop movement suggested experimentation with approach routes that might bypass established defensive lines. These were minor variations when considered individually, yet cumulatively, they indicated a level of coordination and planning that the standard operational procedures did not fully anticipate. Bauer's diligence in recording the details, unit size, formation spacing, and timing provided a continuous record that could later be analysed to detect emerging trends. Meanwhile, the limitations of command protocols became more apparent. Officers at company headquarters relied heavily on standardised reports, often prioritizing metrics such as troop strength and supply levels over nuanced observational detail. Bauer's communications, while accurate and timely, were treated as supplementary rather than decisive, and his notes on small deviations were interpreted as isolated incidents, rather than potential indicators of larger movements. The mismatch between detailed observation at forward posts and the aggregated assessments at higher levels contributed to an operational lag, one that began to manifest as missed opportunities to anticipate Allied manoeuvres. By October 7th, Bauer's observations suggested a pattern of reconnaissance that hinted at an impending flanking manoeuvre along a previously quiet sector of the ridge. He recorded the repeated use of hidden trails and the presence of small engineering teams preparing minor obstacles or clearing paths. These signs, though subtle, reflected a deliberate adjustment in enemy tactics. Bauer transmitted his findings with urgency. They're highlighting the repetition and unusual concentration of movement in specific areas. The message reached headquarters, yet the operational response remained limited. The information, while accurate, did not immediately alter the disposition of defensive units, largely due to a combination of protocol rigidity and competing intelligence assessments from other sources.